Good afternoon, BookTube. I'm pleased to be joining you for yet another video, and I would like to talk about, arguably, by the inimitable, the unforgettable, the rapacious, the charismatic, the witty Christopher Eric Hitchens, whose essay collection, arguably, I recently finished, all 750 pages of it, and I think that it is incumbent upon me to go through it, to discuss what I enjoyed about it, to discuss what I found frustrating about it, and to reflect on the life and legacy of this extraordinary figure in British and international literary life. As I've said many times before on this channel, Hitchens has been a massive influence on me ever since I discovered him as a teenager, and it is somewhat scandalous that I have had this book on my shelf for about 4 years now, and have only just gotten round to reading the whole thing from cover to cover. So I can now proudly say that I have read all of arguably every single essay and article, and it is a generous collection of Hitchens' writings over the course of the 2000s, collected from various places. He wrote for quite a few news outlets during his time in the business, and these include The Nation, Slate, The Atlantic, the London Review of Books, which is actually a place where I've had the privilege to read a lot of his stuff, a lot of which is often forgotten because it's from the earlier part of his career. But there is some stuff from there. There is also stuff from which other outlets did he write for? Let's see here. There are so many different ones that he wrote for over the course of his time in the journalistic world. Vanity Fair, that's the one. That's the one I wasn't quite remembering. But in any case, that is a summary for you, just to give you an idea of the reach of the man. This collection contains articles and essays of various kinds. A lot of them are book reviews that he wrote of books that had been just released, often biographies of writers that he knew, often obscure writers as well, writers that I didn't know anything about, and he talks about these writers in such a subtle and a thoughtful way that it's a big difference, really. It's quite a contrast from the public persona of Hitchens, which was this pugnacious political commentator, this strident, declamatory figure who would rubbish religion and who would thunderously justify the invasion of Iraq, for example, who would slam the Christian right, as he often did in his religious debates with them, who infamously laid into Islam, who was a vituperative critic of Bill Clinton, and yet in his more literary work, in his literary criticism, we have a much more subtle Hitchens. So I thought that was interesting to see. What else did I notice? Well, I also noticed an ironic contradiction to the man's whole worldview when it comes to religion. Because this is the man who famously said that religion poisons everything. And yet he was able to maintain this position whilst being full of praise for the Protestant reformers, people such as William Tyndale, who helped to produce his beloved King James. It was Tyndale's translation that was actually used as the basis for the King James translation. And Hitchens would speak in such glowing terms of these people, often people who were every bit as intolerant as the Catholics that he denounces so fiercely. Another thing I found ironic in connection with this whole question of religion is that there is an article in here, or an essay rather, in which he writes effusively about John Brown, and he is careful to mention, parenthetically, that John Brown was motivated in his anti-slavery crusade by a passionate and fanatical Calvinism, which, again, somewhat contradicts this idea that religion poisons everything. Because here you have an example of a man who, strongly influenced by his religious beliefs, fought against slavery. So how do you square the circle there? And Hitchens infamously argued in God Is Not Great that religion poisoned everything. He was a tireless proselytizer of this idea that religion poisoned everything, and very adamant that any good that was achieved by religion was far outweighed by the bad that religion was responsible for. And time again, we see in this book, God Is Not Great, which I actually have here to display, time and time again, he makes the argument that essentially, if something is good, or something that Hitchens approves of, then he refuses to accept that religion should be given any credit. But if it's something that Hitchens passionately despises, for example, Nazism, he is very quick to link that to religion. He even goes as far as to say that communism wasn't simply an example of religion, and not, in fact, what it actually was, which is a secular totalitarian ideology, which had atheism at its core. So again, we see some of the contradictions in his thought here, but there was a lot in here that I really enjoyed. I binge read this for several days, and there were certain essays and articles which I enjoyed more than others. I really enjoyed the articles where he's writing about his foreign travels. So Christopher Hitchens was a prolific journeyman. He was always in some foreign part of the world or other. He had a voracious interest in other peoples and other cultures. He was a tireless and indefatigable champion of foreign causes, whether it be the cause of the Kurds in Kurdistan, or the cause of the Iraqi liberals, or the cause of the people of Afghanistan who were fighting the Taliban, or the cause of the people in the rest of the Arab world and Muslim world who are fighting for their freedom against murderous, oppressive dictators, often backed up by the West. And I think that in this aspect of his worldview, he never really left the Trotskyism, the revolutionary socialism of his youth. So that is a really interesting aspect of his character to observe and to see played out in these essays. I really enjoyed, in particular, an article that he wrote about his time in Iran and his time speaking to the ordinary people of that beleaguered country, and what Hitchens was able to uncover in his foreign journeys was an immense amount of hardiness and bravery and spiritedness among the people that he spoke to and that he lived among. He writes with a deep empathy for these people and for their struggles, and you get the sense that he really made an effort to try and understand the foreigners that he interacted with on a very deep level. Hitchens was often rubbished and criticized by many of his enemies on the left, as having something of a savior complex. And I don't really see that in these essays. What I see is someone who earnestly, perhaps too earnestly, believed in the power of these poor peoples to remake their societies. If anything, he was guilty of having too much faith, as opposed to having a savior complex. But I don't think you can read these essays and articles and come out convinced that he was some sort of rancid racist imperialist, as many on the left still try to portray him as being. So that's what I would say with regards to that. I would definitely like to read out some of my favourite parts. There is an essay at the very end of this collection in which he laments the problems caused by his bibliomania and the havoc that it wreaks on his life. This is called Prisoner of Shelves. In Bruce Chatwin's novel, Utz, the eponymous character becomes the captive of his porcelain collection, and eventually loses his life because he cannot move without it. From this book, I learned that a word actually exists, Porzellankrankheit, for the mania for porcelain acquisition. I also learned that the root of the word is the same as that for pig, because poured trays of molten porcelain looked so pink and fat and shiny. I'm pretty sure of my facts here, and if I could only put my hands on the book, I could be absolutely sure. But is it shelved under U for Utz? Or perhaps under C for Chatwin? Or is it in that unsorted pile on top of the radiator? Or the heap of volumes that migrated from the living room to the dining room? I am certain that I didn't lend it to anyone. I am utterly miserly about letting any of my books out of sight. Yet my books don't seem to reciprocate by remaining within view, let alone within easy reach. So that, I think, is something that all of us bibliophiles here on BookTube can sympathize with. This phenomenon of having so many books that when it comes to trying to track down a specific book that we are in need of, we find ourselves in dire straits. We find ourselves unable to even recall where it might have been, let alone the exact location. What else do we have here? But for some reason, the available shelf space, which is considerable, continues to be outrun by the appearance of new books. So despite living in a fairly spacious apartment in Washington, he still could not find the space for all the books he bought. Again, something I think we can all sympathize with. Bibliomania cripples my social life. In order to have a dinner party, I must clear all the so far unsorted books off the dining room table. Some kind friends argue for a cull, to create more space and to provide an incentive to organize. All right, but I can't throw out a book that has been with me for any length of time and thus acquired sentimental value, or that has been written by a friend, or that has been signed or inscribed by its author. I also can't part with one that might conceivably come in handy as a work of reference, however obscure, all of which provokes newfound sympathy for poor Caspar Utz. So that is how the article ends. Again, as I've said before, I think all of us book lovers can relate to Hitchens' predicament here. Getting rid of books is a painful experience, as I myself have found out recently in having to cull a lot of my precious book collection, because there were so many books that I had had for years and I was clearly never going to get round to actually reading. And yet even so, the process of having to get rid of them was far from easy. I can now say that many of the books that I've gotten rid of are books that I now hardly ever think about, which goes to show how little they actually meant to me in the first place, even though it was difficult for me to let go of them initially. So I definitely feel much better having culled a lot of what's in my collection. but I still retain a determination to hold on to as many books as possible, and I think that Hitchens has provided in that article a very succinct, a very eloquent statement of the problem faced by so many of us when it comes to keeping our book collection under control. What else did I want to say about arguably? Well, it's written with Hitchens' customary punchy prose. I found that even the articles on things that I wasn't that interested in, for example, these fairly obscure authors, were still written in such a way that I was deeply engaged. And Hitchens has the knack for finding the juiciest quotations from the works that he is considering, that he is criticizing. And they're often very funny quotations as well. The kinds of quotations that actually make you want to go away and read the book and read the whole of the original that he's quoting from, just to get a better sense of what he's talking about. Because the bits he does quote are very, very entertaining and insightful indeed. Now, in typical Hitchens fashion, he does overreach. So there are parts of this book where he goes off on his familiar rant about religion. He repeats the fallacy that he also made in God is Not Great, about how the Catholic Church, or the Christian Church in general, tried to stop the Bible being published in the vernacular for the first 1,500 years. And he repeats this myth about how, until the Protestants came along, there was no such thing as a Bible in one's native tongue, which is a lie, an easily disprovable falsehood, because, as a matter of fact, the Bible was, at the time of the Protestant Reformation, probably the most widely translated book in human history. So Hitchens is simply repeating a false Protestant myth there about how Catholics tried to hide the truth of the Bible from the masses. Another area he overreaches is where he is praising Karl Marx, and he's praising Marx as a journalist. This is from an article called Karl Marx, The Grub Street Years. And in that article, yes, it's called Marxist Journalism, The Grub Street Years. And in that article, he says something along the lines of, it's often said that journalism is the first draft of history. Well, people who think that should go and read Marx and read the only person of whom this was true. And it's quite simply not true that Marx is the only person of whom it can be said that his journalism was the first draft of history. Many of you will be familiar with William Shirer's The Rise of the Third Reich, or The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Surely his work also counts if we're going to talk about how journalists have often written the first drafts of history. And moreover, in any good history book, some of the primary sources that are the most generously represented are undoubtedly newspaper articles. So what Hitchens was thinking when he made this absurd remark about how only Marx can claim to have written journalistic articles that count as the first draft of history is not clear. I think it was just his typical Hitchens hyperbole, and of course his own bias and enthusiasm for his hero Karl Marx. But that said, this is still a very rewarding essay collection. Any admirer of Hitchens should have it on their shelf, and I really enjoyed my time reading it. You won't be disappointed. It includes, of course, reflections on his other heroes like Orwell and Trotsky. It includes... what have I forgotten to mention? I particularly enjoyed the bits on history. If Hitchens had been a bit less partisan in his beliefs, it's possible that he would have made a good historian. and he often said that he regretted not studying English or history at university because they were the two subjects that he was the best at school. And his commentary on history, especially on the history books that he read during his lifetime, are very erudite and very enjoyable indeed. And they include a biography, I believe he read of Jefferson, some stuff that he read on Abraham Lincoln, and quite a few others here. There's also his famous riposte to Gore Vidal, which I think is one of the most devastating things that has ever been written about any public figure. I would say that he effectively wrote Gore Vidal's epitaph before he'd even died. So that is just a small summary, really, of this mammoth book, which I cannot do justice to in the time I have. But that is arguably by Christopher Hitchens. I highly recommend. Signing off for now.